The question, I think, was about the particular comment within the National Education Service about respecting all forms of education, which I think is wholly admirable as a statement. And I think you were particularly relating to the way in which you might assess different forms of learning, whether or not qualifications ought to be as much to the fore as they are within our current system, and integrally around learning according to interest, and perhaps, to paraphrase it, learning for learning's own sake, rather than as in an instrumental way. I think that the comment within the strategy, well, not within the strategy, sorry, within the National Education Service about respecting all forms of education is absolutely right. I'm kind of very supportive of that. And it does talk about informal learning and other forms of learning beyond the formal system. And it talks about the vocational, academic or technical education being valued. Interestingly, kind of points to pick up on that, I think, it does begin to fall into the use of the word technical rather than the word vocational. One of the big reservations I had about the election campaign in 2015 led, I'm trying to think, I'm always getting my election years mixed up now. I think it was 2010 actually, that shows how old I am. The Miliband quote that we ought to do something for the 50% of young people that don't do academic. That approach really has the implication that vocational is for those that can't do academic, and it's for other people's children, not middle class children, and that therefore inevitably it's consigned to being of lesser status. So first of all, the National Education Service comments uses the word technical, which is almost replacing vocational, which is effectively been treated as a damaged word. Now, how much of that is marketing and how much of that is substance, there's a difference between technical and vocational, I think is interesting to consider. And I think it does begin to bring you to those points about where does respect come from? Well, respect doesn't come from sameness. So assessing technical education in the same way as academic education, in my estimation, will result always in technical education being seen as a second-class form of learning. Part of the respect comes from respecting the difference between the style of learning involved in technical education, where the content comes from, and how it will be assessed. Essentially, in technical education, practice is as important as theory. There's still a need for theory in order to interpret practice and experience, but actually technical education rests upon the ability to do things and to be seen to be doing things. And there's a whole constellation, I think, of characteristics that follow from that, which we discussed earlier on your table, which was about who teaches it, how it's taught, the interaction between practice and experience, or practice and theory, and also the fact that actually the people that are teaching this need to be trusted to assess whether or not someone is safe to be released into the world, to cook your meals, to fly my aeroplanes, to put the electric ring main around your building, and actually make judgments around your safety. You don't achieve that by just doing a written exam around the ideas applying to the flow of electricity, or to the aeronautics applying to the aeroplane you're sitting in. So I think that respect needs to be teased out much more with our National Education Service. It's interesting also the National Education Service does pick up on the T levels, and I mentioned it, I'm concerned they want to extend it potentially to areas that be hard to see as being technical, and hard to see how you could generate around some of those skills easily a level of practice and experience which equates to kind of level 3, the A level area. Doesn't mean to say people don't have to be educated and trained for those occupations, but I do feel there's a danger of it becoming for 50% that don't do academic. It becomes of lower order and status. So thinking through that whole thing, that whole comment about equal respect for different forms of education is much more complicated than is implied in a single statement within the National Education Service.
We were discussing lots of things.
Where can we seek exemplars of best practice elsewhere in the world that might inform consideration of a national education service in the United Kingdom? Although, as I explained in my talk, before this being a devolved matter, this is National Education Service for England, and not for the other four nations, or the other three nations would be up to them whether or not they adopt whatever develops in England, which increasingly they're not. Policy learnings from other systems and countries is problematic, and a lot of people have written more academic tomes than I have in this area. And my particular area of expertise is around technical education systems or skills development. I think there are two observations I'd make that are relevant about learnings in this. First of all, quantity or size is an issue to consider here. Some of the exemplar systems that people are fond of quoting, like Singapore or Finland, are much smaller countries than ourselves, and it's much easier to do whole systems education reform in a population of 6 million than it is in one of 60 million. And it's much easier to do it also, which is my second observation, in some technical settings than others. So in Germany, the much vaunted and celebrated dual system is a reflection of the German economic model, and also the social consensus that applies in Germany about employers taking a longer view on the return on human capital and seeing as their social duty to invest in the workforce of the future, as well as it being the business thing that's right to do, and also reflects that the very strong Mittelstand type employers in Germany and the larger employers are substantially involved in creation of tangible assets, my point about tangible assets, around manufacturing rather than service industries, which are quickly changing and much more fleet of foot in terms of how the curriculum and learning needs to be transferred into those sectors. So the German dual, so first of all, we have scale. Whole system reform for good or ill, much easier at smaller scales than it is at large scales. Somewhere like the UK, interesting, somewhere like the US, education is quite often, some substantial issues are actually devolved to the individual states rather than is done at the federal level. So you get to sizes and blocks of educational outcomes which actually are more manageable. But secondly, when you go and look at technical education and skills education, I think any skill system needs to be a facsimile or reflection of the business model applying and the economic model applying in that individual country. So if I were looking for an exemplar, and I was looking for a perfect exemplar, I'd be looking for a country the same size as us, with a similar economy to us. And I'm not finding one that easily transfers everything that's better than us. Actually, we have a world-leading education system. PISA tells us that. If I go to somewhere like China, which I have done a number of visits, we have a really strong technical and skills education system in terms of the degree of responsiveness it has to employers and the changing needs of employers. We beat ourselves up a lot about these things, but actually we are still world-leading in many respects. But if we go looking elsewhere in the world, the one thing I'm very reticent about is picking little bits from other people's systems and trying to stitch them together here. Because the little bits quite often don't work unless they're in the total system that applies somewhere else. So we can't easily import a whole system from anywhere because of scale and different circumstances here. But it's also difficult to pick bits you like from somewhere else and trying to stitch it into ours. And we discussed on the table, the German system also has a degree of direction for young people, which would not be tolerated here. There's much more, although there's flexibility later on enough to make choices, much more sorting into sheep and goats earlier in their educational careers to follow the technical route or the academic route or another route. And parents don't have the same degree of choice and volition that we have become used to in England. Making people go back into a more directed system, I think, would be problematic for a lot of people now, to adopt that kind of more directed education system. So, difficult finding exemplars elsewhere. You can find exemplars elsewhere, but policy borrowing is very difficult to do in a sensible way. I think we should have a bit more faith in our own ability to design a system for ourselves, in honesty. And
yes, I mean, I quite agree with what you're saying.
you're challenging me to say that actually we're over-celebratory about the strengths of our own system, where I'm actually saying the opposite. I think sometimes we're so hyper-self-critical of our system, and education gets used as a political football between the parties in terms of finding deficits, where we can all do things better in everything we do in our lives, and we're never as good as we want to be. But my analysis of things like the OECD tables is we're mid to upper table on a large range of indicators, and we properly become concerned when we slip down the table, but we're not low achieving in many areas. If in a 4-quadrant model, we're tending to be around the central area to the upper half rather than down in the bottom left-hand quadrant for many things. That's a very generalistic answer, but I think the stats bear me out on that. But you won't improve unless you constantly challenge yourself to be better. On the issue of English, I will, a little vignette, bring back to a moment to bring that to life before I talk about English, is I was very privileged to sit on the people-to-people dialogue with the Chinese government a few years ago, where our government was very impressed with achievement in China around maths and English, or maths particularly, maths achievement rates compared to us and mastery of basic mathematics. And we were very keen to learn how that was achieved and whether or not it's transferable. To the extent now there are a number of Chinese teachers coming across to actually assist in striving up standards or being exemplars in our schools about how we drive that forward. The Chinese were very interested in learning from us about how we develop creativity and innovation in our young people. And those young people have the ability to imagine new futures and to self-direct and to be healthier and have a better view of themselves rather than being in a directed learning sense all the time and being given a very didactic approach to teaching. So it was a balance. We were doing some things that were interesting. Andrew Marr, in his book, The History of Modern Britain, is very, very good on this, I think, reflecting the fact that, it's difficult to see how a country like China, with its political system and its educational system, would produce the arts schools we had in the 1960s, which is at the turning point of the creative industries, which we're still a world leader in, which comes from the wider approach to our teaching. So, you'll find strengths elsewhere in the world, and you'll find relative weaknesses here in certain areas. But I think we just need to take a sensible view about not beating ourselves up all the time while still seeking to always improve wherever we can. So I didn't answer the question of English quickly. I mean, English is the lingua franca, makes life much easier for us in international education markets. It's an undeniable strength. The great concern of that clearly is, the necessity for young people in England and in UK to learn other languages is reduced by the sheer kind of ubiquity of the use of English. And modern languages decline, I think, in our education service is a matter for real concern.
Martin, I was very interested in what you were saying about autonomy and the benefits of it.
There's autonomy, the benefits of autonomy, and you're elected that particularly to an analogy in the armed forces and how much.
Trying to think of something
No,
you
no,
could get a grip
no. It's
on.
interesting because I think there's something to be learned from there, but only to a certain extent, and also about whether or not we might have a federated admission system across an area where young people, where colleges and
Yes, I was
schools,
thinking particularly of sixth forms.
sixth form schools, and the choice point of that. So the kind of, I see that question in the three elements, and only because enjoyable to think about kind of leadership styles, which is one of the things I'm very interested in. The armed forces are a lot less. Autonomy is a kind of unusual word to use. It's a lot less directed than most people from the outside suppose. In my career, I'm fond to say, and I think it's probably right, I probably gave a direct order to somebody to do something in detail less than 20 times in 28 years. The whole command philosophy was one of tell somebody what the task is, what the objective is, tell them why you want something doing, but leave, as far as you're able to do, the how it gets done to the person with the greatest knowledge and closest to the problem. So that then enables that person to show judgment and to innovation and creativity to come up with solutions. And it's particularly one that always applied to me, particularly in the Air Force, because you couldn't be the expert of about everything that related to your business. So there was a requirement to respect expertise, but you had there was a supervening level where you had to think about what the objectives were, and also ensure coordination between people so that they acted harmoniously and sympathetically one to another. So it was, the whole concept was about say what's needing to be done, why you want it done, but then as far as you're able to step back for dictating precisely how it should be done. It's interesting to see that the National Education Service in that regard, insofar as I think it will fail if, as well as telling people what it is we're seeking to achieve and why that's important, if they begin to specify in detail to teachers how to get the job done, which is one of the problems currently with inspection regimes and performance targets within our education system. The question of autonomy overall is I think, slightly different, because when I was in the armed forces, integrally, my autonomy was ascribed, and I accepted that was the case of it being ascribed. If you have autonomous institutions, then I think one of the quid pro quos of autonomous institutions, including universities and colleges, is they make themselves accountable to those that they serve, rather than having accountability imposed externally. So my argument would be to boards of colleges and universities, the first and most important task is to define who they are, who they serve, why they're doing things, and hold themselves accountable for what they do to those communities and those students that they serve. Externally imposed autonomy, I think, is always going to be a poor second best to that self-sustaining autonomy. But that said, autonomy can't be an absolute. If you're failing and continuing to fail and providing a poor service, there must be some residual way in which you're held to account externally. It's about balance in this, is what I'm trying to say about the new interventionist state. If it tries to intervene in the detail, it will fail, because it will not keep up with the fast-moving modern economy and the social systems we now inhabit. If it begins to think about the points at which it can properly intervene, the framework it creates to give the what and the why people are required to do things, but allow them flexibly to respond, then I think we're more on the lines of an effective interventionist state. In terms of the specific about federated admission system, I don't know what I think about that. I posed it when it's been proposed when I was at the Association of Colleges, substantially. And I'm just remonstrating with myself whether or not that was out of a feeling of a need to support my institutions and who I was paid to support and believing what they believed, and actually whether that was a problem with the federated admission systems. I think fine in theory, difficult to achieve in practice, and that's a bit of a cop-out, but I'm just trying to think through. Inherently, it's likely to become bureaucratic. It must be bureaucratic. I mean, funny enough, bureaucracy is a value-laden word. I mean, if you say bureaucratic, everyone thinks bad. Well, bureaucracy is just the ordered administration of systems, so it's not necessarily inherently a bad thing. But I find it quite difficult to see how you would do that, both in bureaucratic support terms, but also in terms of geographies. And this is another thing about, social geography and size of countries. We have a very congested geography here, and where would you put the line around the catchment area that the application process would apply, particularly that middle-class parents might be able to apply for an area remote from where they live in order to access better, but working-class children might not be able to similarly access. That's not an answer to the fundamental theoretical idea about having, a federated system and people make choices. I think to also have a much better system of information given to young people to make informed choices and their parents to make informed choices. I'm fighting shy of careers advice because I'm not Michael Gove thinking that careers education is a bad thing, but I do think direct careers advice in a modern economy is asking too much of one individual careers advisor to give every young person sound and serious advice in a way which is kind of very 60s-ish, and it was never right. So I think it's about education for informed choices. So the idea is hard to argue against. The practicalities seem to me to be manifest, and how much effort and time and resources I devote to this in a national education service compared to the other things that need to be funded, I'm not sure this would be the head of my priorities.
In the group, our concern was that
No one's put that one to me before, to be honest, and I think, and actually the National Education Service proposal, I don't remember if it's a manifesto or the charter, actually says outrightly, particularly in the area of further education and technical education, we've been subject to too much change and not insufficient amount of policy stability in order to judge the benefits of each successive change. So I'm instinctively more drawn to an evolutionary approach rather than to try and turn up the whole thing upside down, because I actually think in my area of the world, further education and technical education, that's been done too often. The Germans have changed their dual system twice since 1946, when we had a significant role in reintroducing apprenticeships to Germany after the Second World War. We've changed ours, variously described for somewhere between 50 and 70 times in the same period. And you know what? What's interesting, I just made that figure up. And I made it up a number of times before, though City and Guilds have done some analysis. Depends what you call big reforms and smaller reforms, you can count it however you like. The fact is, everyone in the room sort of immediately, sympathetically said we change this too often. So I kind of think I'm instinctively conservative with a small p. About complicated systems, you change a bit here, a bit there, but you keep a view of the whole system and the consequences those small changes have for the whole system, and you test and adjust, In that respect, I'm kind of pretty much into the whole theory around, tipping points and nudge theory, and rather than trying to control the whole thing and revise the whole thing. So I'm kind of welcoming the lack of radicalism, if you want to see in those terms. That said, I think it is pretty radical. I think it's radical about those statements I made about education being a public good. And I think it's radical around having a strong interventionist state, ensuring autonomy of institutions. Those are pretty radical, and actually I think the commitments in terms of what they add up to in terms of cost probably would require a fairly radical shift in our tax system towards, Scandinavian level sort of taxation in order to underwrite Scandinavian level of public services, rather than, as I've said to one of the other groups, Scandinavian levels of service on American levels of tax. So you kind of that will prove to be pretty radical about the collation of all of those measures being added up to one to be paid for. So, maybe I'm just a stick in the mud, but it's very easy for people to sit in a room even on a cold, not be critical now, on a cold Tuesday night and come up with radical issues. Actually, radicalism's at its day, I think, is my view.